Flight attendant. Insults black woman over her necklace in first class, but by the time the flight landed, the world was watching. Monique Barrett exhaled slowly as she stepped into the cool, pressurized air of the aircraft cabin. A rare moment of indulgence, she reminded herself. This first-class ticket had been a splurge, a reward for years of long hours, endless meetings, and late-night emails. Financial analysts weren't usually the type to treat themselves, but after sealing a multi-million-dollar deal for her firm, she figured she had earned it. She adjusted the strap of her structured leather handbag and made her way down the aisle, her heels clicking lightly against the polished floor. The space was pristine, with oversized seats wrapped in plush cream-colored leather, neatly folded blankets resting on each one. A flight attendant stood near the entrance of the section, offering tight-lipped smiles to passengers as they settled in. Monique barely paid her any mind at first. She was too focused on the simple pleasure of sinking into her seat, stretching out for once without the constraints of cramped legroom. She pulled out her phone, checking her emails one last time before tucking it away. That's when she caught it. The look. It was brief, but unmistakable. The flight attendant, her name tag read Rachel Whitmore, had lingered on Monique a second too long. Not in the way attendants sometimes did when checking for a seat assignment or verifying boarding passes. No, this was different. It carried something else. Monique held her gaze for a beat longer than necessary, silently testing the waters. Rachel's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes flickered, something close to disapproval. And then, just as quickly as it came, it was gone. She turned on her heel, attending to another passenger with a forced politeness that suddenly felt laced with something else. Monique had seen this kind of thing before. The micro moments that were too subtle to call out, but too obvious to ignore. The kind that made you question whether you were imagining things. She brushed a hand over the delicate gold cross resting at her collarbone, a habit she'd picked up since inheriting it from her grandmother. The chain was old but well cared for, carrying decades of quiet prayers and whispered hopes. Across the aisle, an older man in a navy suit adjusted his cufflinks, stealing a glance at her before returning to his in-flight magazine. Another woman, younger, tucked into a window seat, scrolling through her phone without a care in the world. Monique shifted in her seat, deciding it was nothing. Just a moment, just a look, the hum of conversation, the rustle of newspapers, the clink of glasses as pre-flight drinks were served. It was all routine. But something about the way Rachel moved felt different now. The way she greeted a man 2 rows ahead of her, all warm smiles and effortless charm, yet barely acknowledged Monique when she passed. Still, she let it go. She wasn't here to analyze every interaction. She was here to relax, to enjoy this flight without overthinking. But then Rachel returned, this time stopping right at her row. Her hands clasped neatly in front of her, voice light but pointed. "Miss, are you sure you're in the right seat?" Monique's breath hitched for just a second, just long enough to recognize that this was more than a question. But she wasn't about to let this slide. Monique blinked, momentarily taken aback. The question had been wrapped in the kind of politeness that barely masked the intent beneath it. She had flown first class before. Gate agents always verified seat assignments before passengers even stepped on the plane. The only reason Rachel Whitmore was asking now was because she didn't expect Monique to belong here. Monique straightened her posture, tilting her chin slightly. "Yes, I'm sure," she said, her voice steady. "Is there a problem?" Rachel's lips pressed into a tight line, her eyes flicking down to Monique's lap, where her boarding pass rested against the armrest. She didn't pick it up. Didn't need to. Monique knew she had already seen it. But instead of acknowledging her mistake and moving on, Rachel hesitated. No problem," she said, though something in her tone suggested otherwise. "Just making sure." She turned and walked away, but Monique didn't miss the way her fingers gripped the tray table of the empty seat beside her just a little too tightly. Monique exhaled through her nose, willing herself to let it go. She had dealt with people like this before, those who measured worth with assumptions, who thought their bias was too subtle to be noticed. Calling it out wasn't always worth the energy, and she wasn't about to let a flight attendant ruin what was supposed to be a relaxing trip. A few minutes later, another attendant came by offering pre-flight drinks. Monique requested a glass of sparkling water and settled into her seat, trying to shake off the interaction. But Rachel wasn't done. As Monique took a sip from the chilled glass, Rachel reappeared, this time standing just off to the side, pretending to check something on the panel near the galley. Then, in a voice just loud enough for Monique to hear, she muttered under her breath, "Guess they'll let just anyone up here these days." Monique's fingers tightened around the base of her glass. She turned her head slowly, catching Rachel in the act. Their eyes met, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. Rachel didn't look flustered. If anything, she seemed to be daring Monique to say something, to challenge her outright. The weight of the moment settled between them, thick and unmoving. Monique inhaled deeply through her nose, then exhaled just as slow. She refused to be the woman who lost her composure at 30,000 feet. Instead, she gave a measured smile, tilting her head slightly. "You might want to be a little more careful with your words," she said, voice smooth but firm. "Because you never know who's listening." Rachel's expression barely shifted, but the flicker of realization in her eyes was undeniable. Monique wasn't some passive bystander who would let a microaggression slide. Rachel huffed a short breath, barely perceptible, and turned on her heel, disappearing back toward the front of the cabin. Monique leaned back, pressing her head against the plush headrest, willing the irritation out of her system, but she couldn't quite shake it. Because the way Rachel had looked at her, spoken to her, it wasn't just about first class. And Monique had the sinking feeling that this wasn't the last of it. Monique stared out of the small oval window, watching the ground crew move around the tarmac as the last few passengers boarded. She had spent years perfecting the art of picking her battles, but something about Rachel Whitmore's behavior gnawed at her. It wasn't just a bad attitude or poor service. It was targeted. Intentional. She could ignore it, sure. Take the high road. Let it roll off her back. But experience had taught her that ignoring it didn't always make it stop. Sometimes it only made people bolder. The cabin doors sealed with a firm click, and the captain's voice crackled over the speakers, welcoming everyone aboard. The flight attendants moved with the usual efficiency, ensuring overhead bins were latched, seatbelts fastened, and passengers properly settled. Monique exhaled, rolling her shoulders, trying to let it go. And then Rachel returned. She approached Monique's row, this time leaning in a little too close. Her blonde hair was neatly tucked into a bun, her uniform pristine, her smile razor-sharp. But it wasn't warm. It was the kind of smile people used when they wanted to be condescending without saying much at all. "Well, aren't you just so proud?" Rachel mused, her gaze lingering at Monique's collarbone. Monique frowned, unsure of what she meant, until she felt it. Rachel wasn't looking at her. She was looking at the delicate gold cross resting against her skin. Monique instinctively reached up, fingers brushing over the pendant, her grandmother's voice echoing in her mind. "Wear it close to your heart, baby girl. Never be ashamed of it." Rachel let out a small, breathy laugh, tilting her head as if the sight of Monique wearing the cross was some kind of joke. "Trying to make a statement?" she asked, voice dripping with false curiosity. Monique's jaw tightened. "A statement?" she repeated, arching a brow. Rachel gave a slight shrug, standing upright, adjusting the cuff of her uniform sleeve. "It's just interesting, that's all. You don't see that a lot up here." Up here, Monique felt the heat crawl up her neck. She wasn't stupid. She knew exactly what Rachel meant. First class, this space, this seat, and now this cross around her neck. It all seemed to be a problem for Rachel. The absurdity of it settled over her, mixing with quiet anger. She wasn't about to explain herself to someone like this. She didn't need to. She smiled, slow and deliberate. "You're right," she said, smoothing her hands over her lap. "You don't see a lot of faith in places like this. That's probably why you're struggling with it." Rachel's expression twitched, her eyes narrowing just enough for Monique to know the words had landed. She opened her mouth as if to respond, but before she could, another voice cut through the tension. "You might want to move along now," a man's voice said. Rachel's head snapped to the left, where a businessman across the aisle was watching the exchange, his gaze steady. He was in his mid-50s, with greying hair and a tailored suit that screamed old money. His expression wasn't aggressive, but it was firm. unimpressed even. Rachel stiffened. For the first time since the interaction started, Monique saw hesitation in her eyes. She inhaled sharply through her nose, then, without another word, spun on her heel and walked away. Monique let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. But she wasn't the only one who noticed. Someone had started recording. Monique hadn't noticed the phone at first. Her focus had been locked on Rachel, on the way she practically spat the words "up here," as if first class belonged to a select few. But now, in the corner of her eye, she saw it. Just past the businessman who had spoken up, a woman across the aisle, late 30s, brown hair pulled into a loose ponytail, was holding her phone at an angle that wasn't subtle. She wasn't scrolling, she wasn't texting, she was recording. Rachel must have seen it too, because her movements suddenly became sharper, more deliberate. She strode toward the galley, fingers curling into her palm like she was trying to hold something back. Monique exhaled slowly, leaning back in her seat. She didn't ask for this, didn't want to be part of a spectacle. But she also knew how these moments went. Some people would say she was imagining things, that it wasn't that bad, that Rachel hadn't really meant anything by it. The recording? That changed everything. The businessman, who had spoken up a moment earlier, glanced toward Monique. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low enough that it wouldn't carry. Monique managed a small nod. "Yeah," she said. "I've been through worse." His mouth pressed into a thin line, a flicker of something in his eyes. Understanding, maybe. Frustration. He shook his head slightly, muttering, "Unbelievable," before turning his attention back to his reading material. Across the aisle, the woman with the phone caught Monique's eye and gave a slight nod. A silent, "I saw that too." Monique appreciated it more than she could say, but the moment wasn't over. Rachel returned, moving stiffly, her face carefully neutral. This time, she didn't stop at Monique's row. She made a beeline toward the woman with the phone. "I'm going to have to ask you to stop recording," Rachel said, voice tight. The woman didn't lower her phone. "I'm just documenting what happened." Rachel's jaw flexed. "That's against policy." The woman raised an eyebrow. "Is it?" Rachel faltered. For the first time, she didn't seem so sure of herself. She turned her gaze toward the front of the cabin, as if searching for backup. But no one was coming to help her. Passengers were watching now. The energy in the cabin had shifted. A few rows ahead, someone whispered something. A man leaned toward his wife, shaking his head. Another passenger, a younger black man in business attire, glanced back, taking in the situation. Rachel's eyes flicked between them all, her breath tightening. Then finally she muttered, "Whatever," and walked away. Monique let out a slow breath. The woman with the phone leaned slightly toward her. "I'll be posting this," she said under her breath. "Just so you know." Monique hesitated. A part of her didn't want to be at the center of this. She had only wanted to take a flight, enjoy a seat she had paid for like everyone else. But another part of her, the part that had spent years biting her tongue in rooms where people thought she didn't belong, knew that Rachel's actions shouldn't just disappear into thin air. She met the woman's gaze and gave a small nod. Rachel had made her choices. Now the world was about to see them. Rachel's movements were clipped as she made her way toward the front of the cabin. Monique could practically see the tension in her shoulders, the way she straightened her uniform as if that could somehow undo what had just happened. She wasn't the only one feeling the shift. A ripple of quiet conversations had started among the passengers. Some glanced toward Monique, others toward Rachel, while a few exchanged knowing looks. The businessman who had spoken up earlier wasn't reading his magazine anymore. He was watching. And then a new voice entered the scene. "Excuse me, ma'am." A different flight attendant, older, with a name tag that read Linda Monroe, appeared beside Rachel. Her voice was steady, but there was something unmistakable in her expression. Concern. Linda's eyes flickered toward the phone still recording across the aisle, then back to Rachel. Rachel's face was tight. "I was just handling a situation," she said, her words clipped. Linda didn't respond right away. Instead, she turned to Monique, her gaze softening slightly. "Is everything all right, ma'am?" Monique could have let it go. She could have shaken her head, pretended nothing happened. But why should she? She met Linda's eyes. "No," she said plainly. It's not. Rachel stiffened. I'd like to speak to a supervisor. Monique interrupted, her voice calm but firm. Now, Rachel sucked in a breath, her expression flickering between irritation and something close to panic. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could, Linda gave a small nod. Of course, she said, already reaching for her earpiece. Give me just a moment. Rachel's face darkened. She turned toward Linda, whispering something low and urgent. But whatever she said, Linda didn't react. Monique sat still, heart steady, waiting. A few minutes later, a tall man in a dark suit stepped into the first-class cabin. His presence was immediately commanding. The kind of person whose job was to make problems disappear before they spiraled into PR disasters. His badge read, Greg Saunders, in-flight supervisor. He approached Monique's seat with a carefully measured expression, one that screamed corporate professionalism. Ma'am, I understand there's been a concern raised, he said smoothly. Monique gave a slow nod. Yes, she said. Your flight attendant has been harassing me since I boarded. Greg barely reacted, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. He turned toward Rachel. Is that right? Rachel's hands clenched at her sides. I wasn't harassing her. I was just... She questioned my seat, Monique cut in. Made snide remarks about my presence here. And then went out of her way to comment on my necklace. She tilted her head slightly. So you tell me, Mr. Saunders. What would you call that? The silence that followed was suffocating. Rachel's mouth opened, then closed. Her face had gone pale. Greg inhaled through his nose slowly. Ms. Whitmore. Please come with me. Rachel flinched. Wait. I was just... Now, Greg said, his voice leaving no room for argument. Rachel stood frozen for a second, her hands gripping the hem of her uniform. She turned to Monique, eyes flashing with something ugly. But it was too late. Linda stepped forward, gesturing toward the galley. Rachel hesitated for only a moment before finally spinning on her heel and walking away. The cabin remained eerily quiet. Greg exhaled and turned back to Monique. I apologize for your experience, he said carefully. We take matters like this very seriously. Monique didn't respond right away. Instead, she let her eyes drift across the cabin, to the businessman who had backed her up, to the woman still holding her phone, to the passengers who had been watching everything unfold. She wasn't the only one who had seen it, and now neither was the airline. But the real consequences were just beginning. By the time the plane touched down at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, the cabin was buzzing, not with excitement, but with tension. Passengers whispered in hushed tones, exchanging glances, their eyes flicking toward Monique, toward the front of the plane where Rachel had disappeared. Monique remained still, her fingers resting lightly on her lap. She wasn't smug. She wasn't triumphant. She was just exhausted. Linda, the senior flight attendant, had returned to her seat twice during the flight, offering small reassurances. We're handling it, she had said quietly. You did the right thing speaking up. Monique had simply nodded. But the real reckoning wasn't happening in the sky. It was happening online. Somewhere at 35,000 feet, the video had made its way to social media. The woman across the aisle had posted it, captioned simply, First-class flight attendant harasses a paying black woman for existing. The comments came fast. She thought she could get away with this. She really had the nerve to ask if she was in the right seat. Look at the way she reacts when she realizes she's being filmed. Priceless. Monique wasn't on her phone, but she knew how these things worked. The moment they hit the internet, they took on a life of their own. She gathered her things, adjusting the strap of her bag as the plane taxied to the gate. Then, just as the seatbelt sign blinked off, Greg Saunders, the in-flight supervisor, returned to her row. Ms. Barrett, he said, his voice lower now, more careful. I just wanted to personally let you know that we've already escalated the incident. Rachel Whitmore will not be working on this return flight. Monique turned her head, studying him. And after that? Greg hesitated. We take matters of discrimination seriously, he said. We'll be reviewing the incident thoroughly. Monique let the words sit between them. He wasn't promising anything. He wasn't saying she'd be fired, that real consequences would come. Just that it would be reviewed. She gave him a small, unreadable smile. "Well, I'm sure you'll have plenty of feedback soon," she said, finally reaching for her phone. Greg's brow furrowed slightly, but then understanding settled in. His eyes darted briefly toward the passengers still seated around them, toward the woman who had recorded the whole thing. He straightened his tie. "Safe travels, ma'am." Monique nodded once. The flight crew started opening the doors, and passengers began gathering their belongings. As Monique stepped into the aisle, she caught sight of Rachel in the galley. She looked different now, deflated. Her arms were crossed tightly over her chest, and her face was pale, expression tight. She wasn't looking at Monique anymore. She was looking at her phone. Monique didn't need to see the screen to know what she was reading. Her face unreadable, Monique adjusted her bag on her shoulder and stepped into the jet bridge. Rachel had underestimated her. She had assumed that she could say what she wanted, do what she wanted, and it would be forgotten by the time the flight landed. But that wasn't how the world worked anymore. And it never should have worked that way to begin with, because no one should have to prove they belong. Prejudice thrives in the quiet moments, the ones where people think no one will notice. But the world is changing. People are watching. And those who refuse to change with it will always learn the hardest way possible. If you've ever faced something like this, know that your voice matters. Standing up for yourself matters. What do you think? Should airlines do more to hold employees accountable for discrimination? Let's talk about it in the comments. And if you want more real stories that challenge injustice, make sure to subscribe.